kind of person in their home. And since you've moved in, we've had niggers and spics and kites and all kinds of disgusting people in front of your house, on the lawn. And I looked at him, I never heard those words before. I didn't know what the hell he was talking about. So I mean, I was hysterical at this point because my brother was bleeding. I thought he was going to die. And I went home and I called my dad, who came home from work, and took my little brother to the hospital. And later on explained to me that just because somebody was a deacon in a church didn't mean that they were a good person. And he said, if you show me a religious person, a really religious person, I'll show you a really big hypocrite. He said, just, you know, one of the reasons that I'm an atheist. And there were several other incidences through my life. Oh, by the way, my father went over. First time I ever saw him get angry or violent, and he punched the guy in the nose later on. But there were several other incidences that throughout my life that reinforced my atheism.
Sure. 3 minutes though, Andrea.
Speak a minute, so yeah. I'm done. But thank you guys for listening. And really, atheism is the only way to be or go.
Thank you, Andrea. If anyone would like to be part of our Atheist Minute presentations in the future, usually, again, it's some story or experience that relates to you and your identity. We create this space for our community members. We've been doing this for about 6 months now. If you'd like to get on the list of people to give an Atheist Minute at a future meeting, go ahead and write me. I'll put my email in the chat. All right, with that, we're going to keep rolling and get started. I just lost the page. There it is. I've got your bio, Sarah. Wonderful. All right, so I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today. So Atheists United is just thrilled to host this reporting fellow for Type Investigations, Sarah Posner. She's an investigative reporter, and her investigative reporting and analysis on the religious right in Republican politics has appeared in Rolling Stones, The New Republic, Vice, Huffington Post, The Nation, Mother Jones, New York Times, The Washington Post, The American Prospect, Talking Points Memo. I'm sure that list is much, much longer. Her new book, Unholy, Why White Evangelicals Worship at the Altar of Donald Trump, was published in May. She also has a book that was published in 2008 called God's Prophet, Faith, Fraud, and the Republican Crusades for Values Voters, exploring the unholy alliance between the Republican Party and prosperity televangelists. She's been on a media tour around the country virtually right now, and we are thrilled to have her stop in virtually in Los Angeles. Help me in welcoming Sarah Posner.
Thank you, Evan, and thanks everyone for inviting me to speak to your group today. I'm in DC right now, and I hope everyone in California is staying safe from both COVID and the wildfires. So as Evan said, this is my new book, Unholy, and I'm going to talk for a while about it. And I have found at other events that the audience is very engaged and curious with questions. So I'll be sure to leave a lot of time for that, so that I can try to answer as many of the questions from the audience as I can. Because I think given our current moment and with the election coming up, people have a lot of questions about Trump's base and why it remains so dedicated to him. So I'm going to start, even though the book goes back quite a ways in time to explore this relationship, but I want to start with the current moment and with the question that a lot of people, I think, ask themselves and a lot of people ask me. And it can be boiled down to how did Trump become president, and how is Trump still president, given all of the scandals and the impeachment and the criminality and the corruption, and you all know the list goes on and on and on. And Trump would be nowhere politically without his religious right base, because white evangelicals, who make up a very significant portion of the Republican Party electorate, the Republican electorate, are more homogeneously in Trump's corner than any other religious demographic. So even more than white Catholics or white mainline Protestants, white evangelicals are Trump's most devoted religious demographic. 81% of them voted for him in 2016, and his approval rating with these voters has fluctuated throughout his presidency between 65% and 80%. But even when the approval rating dips a little bit at various moments, including during the COVID pandemic, these voters tell pollsters that they intend to vote for him anyway. So a recent Pew poll, for example, showed that his approval rating with white evangelicals was about in the mid 60s, but 82% of them told the Pew pollsters that they still intended to vote for him. And so when you look back throughout his presidency at various scandals that took place, and including the impeachment proceedings, white evangelicals remained in his camp. They insisted that the Democratic Party was out to get him, or the deep state was out to get him, and that all of this was made up and fake news. So every sort of conspiracy theory that Trump throws out there through his Twitter feed or during campaign rallies or however else he might be communicating with his base on Fox News, these are conspiracy theories that resonate a lot with his white evangelical base, and is repeated by his white evangelical supporters who are in leadership positions, either at political organizations or megachurch pastors. And so a lot of his sort of conspiratorial rhetoric plays very well with that base. So the book, I know that Evan was encouraging people to read the book before today, but I'm not assuming that everybody who's on the call read it. The book grew out of my reporting on both how the religious right came to support Trump's presidential candidacy in 2016, at the same time that he was appealing to and really energizing for the first time the alt-right, the sort of motley collection of white supremacists and neo-Nazis who were very energized by a major party presidential candidate for the first time. So the fact that he was openly nativist, xenophobic, calling for bans on Muslims or bans on, keeping immigrants out, or just being generally racist and xenophobic at his campaign rallies. This was happening at the same time that the white evangelical base was really falling in line with Trump. Both these camps during the presidential primary in 2015 and 2016 were getting really excited about Trump. And it wasn't in spite of the way he acted or his authoritarian tendencies. It was because of those things. And the leadership of the religious right was skeptical at first. A lot of them were getting behind Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio, or some of them even Ben Carson. But what they saw was that the base was really falling for Trump. And so eventually they came around to supporting Trump as it became clear that he was going to be the one who was going to win the nomination. And they had a handshake about a lot of policy stuff, who he was going to nominate to the Supreme Court, how he was going to, quote unquote, protect their religious liberty, how he was going to nominate judges who would overturn Roe versus Wade. But this handshake was not just transactional. I think a lot of people tend to think of it as, oh yeah, it was a kind of a quid pro quo, no pun intended, kind of a quid pro quo with them so that they could get the judges that they want, to further erode church-state separation, to overturn Roe versus Wade, and so that they could also get political appointments in the administration to carry out similar policies at the policy level, in addition to the legal level. But over the course of the campaign and his presidency, it became clear that it wasn't just a handshake, that this is a deeply held relationship between him and the religious right, and that they appreciate him in ways that go far deeper than just he nominated the right judges, or he gave their allies political appointments within the administration. Many white evangelicals will say, including leaders who are close to Trump and meet regularly with him in the White House, pray regularly with him in the White House, will say that God's hand is on Donald Trump, that God, brought Donald Trump at this time to save America from secularism, to save America from liberalism, to save America from feminism. And so it's very ingrained in his religious right base that that God's hand is on him, or that God anointed him. And that when asked, well, Donald Trump doesn't really seem to be a Christian himself, or he doesn't seem to really know the Bible or be able to cite verses from the Bible, or talk about his own faith, they'll say something like, well, God will often pick an unlikely leader to save a nation at a pivotal point in its history. And I think for the religious right, that pivotal point is they're seeing their cultural dominance on issues like church-state separation, or LGBTQ rights, or reproductive rights slipping away. And so it's important to them to solidify, at least in the law, or in government policies and case law, and legislation even, that would try to implement their ideas despite them being generally unpopular with the public. And so the book charts this relationship along with Trump's growing of his relationship with the white nationalist, white supremacist alt-right. And you can look at, and I think that probably with this audience, you're probably interested more in the religion stuff, but I will add that, in terms of the alt-right, someone like Stephen Miller, who's played a very significant role, obviously, in Trump's immigration policy, is again like an example, sort of a parallel example of someone who the alt-right very much values having in Trump's administration, because of his willingness to enact these harsh immigration policies and try to control what the federal agencies like DHS are doing with regard to immigration detention and family separation and so on. So the book charts that, and then takes a look back at the history of the religious right and its relationship with what was then known as the New Right. So probably all of you are familiar with the Moral Majority, or at least the term the Moral Majority, which was the organization that was founded by Jerry Falwell Sr. in 1979. And that relationship grew out of an effort by the New Right, which was kind of an upstart movement that grew out of Barry Goldwater's failed presidential campaign, and was right-wingers who thought that the Republican Party was, kind of too white shoe country club Republican. They wanted to create a political movement that was more right-wing populist, and targeted at what they perceived to be white middle American Christians who thought that the country was going in the wrong direction. And so when you look at it in that context and in that historical context, the book takes a look at how this movement was pretty much against the civil rights movement, was against other social changes that were happening at the same time, such as the Supreme Court's cases in the early 1960s striking down mandatory school prayer and mandatory public school Bible reading, and that what was happening simultaneously was the growth of segregation academies. These are private schools intended to allow white parents to send their kids to a segregated school while the public schools in the area were being desegregated, and private K through 12 Christian schools, which were essentially segregated, weren't explicitly marketed as such. But the Internal Revenue Service had a policy of trying to get these schools, warning them that their tax exemption was going to be at stake if they did not take steps to try to diversify or not have discriminatory admissions policies, or admissions policies that basically resulted in a segregated or mostly white student population. And so it's out of that moment that these white evangelicals and fundamentalists become engaged with the new right and become engaged with national politics. And this idea that the government, they claimed that the government trying to institute these policies to desegregate schools violated their religious freedom. And it's this inflection point, not really Roe versus Wade in 1973, but this schools issue and this idea that the government enacting policy that was intended to carry out and fully carry out the promise of civil rights and school desegregation was something that violated their religious freedom. And you see that hanging over the religious right today. One of the things that happened in the 70s was Bob Jones University, the fundamentalist school in South Carolina, did have its tax exemption taken away because it had an explicit policy that it claimed was part of its belief in the Bible. They had a policy against interracial dating on its campus. And that case and the battle between the K through 12 Christian schools and the IRS still hangs over the religious right. They still talk about the Bob Jones University case. They talked about it when Obergefell, the 2015 case from the Supreme Court legalizing same-sex marriage. They brought that up in the run-up to Obergefell and after Obergefell, like talking about it's our religious freedom to be anti-gay marriage, and if what happens if the government comes after us and takes our tax exemption away because we oppose same-sex marriage. Obviously that did not happen, but it shows you the extent to which this idea that the government wants to take your religious freedom away by enacting these pro-civil rights, pro-equality kind of policies. This is the ferment out of which Trumpism and the religious rights support for Trump and Trumpism grew. And then the last part of the book, I take a look at how the Trump administration is carrying out policy and how these policies, particularly in agencies like the Department of Justice and Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Education even, lead the religious right to call Donald Trump the most pro-religious freedom president ever, because they believe that he is letting them enact policies that protect their religious freedom in the ways that they wanted, or to counter that kind of Bob Jones University situation. And I also take a look at how Trump is, and this religious right support for Trump and for authoritarians around the world is part of a global movement of including religious right activists around the world, Christian right activists around the world, in the direction of these right-wing autocrats, who many of whom also signal to their followers that they are protecting the Christian heritage of their country. So someone like Viktor Orban or Vladimir Putin or Bolsonaro in Brazil, all of these leaders are right-wing populist autocrats who also play on this idea that they are protecting their country's Christian heritage from from various things. In some cases, it's from migrants who aren't Christian. And in other cases, it's they point to what they call gender ideology, which is kind of their catchphrase for LGBTQ rights and reproductive rights, which they claim have been very harmful to the family and harmful to the heritage and history of these countries that purport to have this Christian heritage. So that is the book in a nutshell. And I can talk more about this relationship between Trump and the religious right, or the history of the religious right in the United States, or what it means that Trump is nominating judges to the federal bench and to the Supreme Court who are extremely skeptical of church-state separation and want to erode the jurisprudence, bolstering the separation of church and state in favor of this idea that the religious freedom of conservative Christians is under siege by changes that took place over the, from the second half of the 20th century through the present, including women's rights, reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, and a greater wall of separation between church and state. So happy to take questions, happy to talk more. If somebody wants me to talk a little bit in more detail about something in particular that I laid out in the presentation, happy to do that, or just take questions.
Wonderful. And if people could put the questions in the chat, that's the best way to keep this organized. I'll read as many questions as I can, and then we'll see how far we get before we open it up a little bit more. To kick things off, I kind of had a question about the Trump era versus the moral majority era you were discussing, or I don't know technically what we call the Rick Santorum era, but how much of that was a handoff versus an insurgency of leaders like Stephen Miller and the Trump administration, or did they always work hand in hand with the Mike Pence and Rick Santorum types that have been around for the past 20 years working on this? Do you get a sense that they kind of swooped in out of nowhere, or they just built upon what was already there?
So I think what they built upon something that was already there. I think what was happening since probably the Bush era was that the religious right was sort of schizophrenic about how it was going to approach immigration. Because on the one hand, a lot of evangelical pastors were seeing immigrants in their churches. So there were this is obviously not everywhere, but in a lot of places in the country where there are a lot of immigrants, pastors of evangelical churches were having a lot of immigrants in their pews. And I think also political operatives were looking at demographic data and realizing that if you were truly to have a free and fair election, that it was going to be becoming increasingly difficult for them to win elections because the younger generation is less white and less religious. And so that's going to create electoral issues for them and relevancy issues for them. And so they kind of had this schizophrenic thing where they would be like, oh, well, yes, of course, we're not against immigrants. And there was, in 2013, there was an effort to pass a comprehensive immigration bill in Congress, and it got a lot of support from, there was much made of the support that it got from some evangelical leaders that ultimately failed because of the basically nativist caucus in the Republican Party killed it. And so this gets to something that I talk about a lot in Unholy, which is that throughout this history, and the history that I look at in the book, the book is mostly my present day journalism, but I do take a look back at the history from the 1960s onward. And when you look at that history, the right, the American right, the American conservative movement, and the Republican Party have played this whack-a-mole game where they know that the base is anti-immigration, right? But they also know that it's not that cool to be that nativist and anti-immigrant openly. And so they basically have this back and forth where some people say the quiet part out loud and they might lose their job, or someone goes too far and they get fired from the think tank that they work at, or fired from the magazine that they work at. So there can be this pretense of oh, look, we got rid of the really nativist guy. Can we get back to business here? And so what happened in the Trump era was Trump was saying all of the quiet parts out loud. Like that was all he did, right? Was to say it all out loud. And same with Stephen Miller, who, you know, we have to remember did not come out of nowhere, had worked for Michelle Bachmann, very prominent figure in the religious right when she was in Congress and still while she's out of Congress. And Jeff Sessions, also another prominent figure to the religious right, but probably more well known to most people because of his anti-immigration views. But he's a very staunch ally of the Christian right. And so Stephen Miller is not an anomaly, but he that Trump has opened up this saying the quiet part out loud and just made it openly the Republican Party's policy and the conservative movement's agenda. Whereas, you know, we went through a period where they tried to tamp it down a little bit, knowing the demographics and knowing the demographic problems that they would face. And now Trump's blown that all up. And, you know, so like you'll see the never Trump Republicans who, you know, you see a lot in the media and on social media, and they're dismayed by this. But it's like, look, it was here all along, right? So like I always have to get a chuckle about how they seem really surprised that it has surfaced now, because it's been part of the DNA of the movement forever. But now Trump has brought it front and center in a way that a Republican president had not.
Wonderful. We had a question from Rita. Does the shared sense of victimization also build the relationship between Trump and evangelicals, both constantly and publicly bemoaning being oppressed and victimized by anyone and everyone who doesn't share their worldview?
Yes, I think that was a big part of why the white evangelical base, and I think we have to be very clear that this is a white movement as opposed to like just evangelicals in general. But I think for the white evangelical base, one of the reasons why Trump was so appealing to them, there were a few reasons, but I think that this persecution and victimization idea is a big one, right? The idea that liberals and all of these, you know, political, they like to call it disparagingly political correctness, is, you know, trying to take away our heritage, which obviously has a lot of, you know, for someone who's fixated on, say, Confederate monuments or something like that, you know, the heritage has one specific meaning. But I think for a lot of people in the Christian right, it also has this idea that they believe that America was founded as a Christian nation, and that secularism and liberalism has, you know, ruined that or tried to take that away or tried to destroy America's Christian heritage. And Trump, even though he himself doesn't really, you know, he obviously doesn't have any fluency with the Bible, but he also doesn't really seem to have a lot of fluency in this kind of revisionist history that the Christian right likes to deploy to try to claim that the founders intended America to be a Christian nation. But he uses certain buzzwords and phrases and sort of very, very directly connotes this sense of grievance that like our way of life or our heritage is being taken away or destroyed in some way that really does appeal to the Christian right. And I would add another thing about his appeal to the Christian right, which is very important and shouldn't be overlooked, and that is the sort of celebrity showmanship that he is basically the hallmark of how he speaks and how he interacts with his base. And it's very much like a prosperity televangelist. Here is somebody who purports to be a very successful businessman. To a lot of people, to a lot of evangelicals, that sort of success, whether it's actually true or not in Trump's case, is unclear. But to them, that shows God's favor. It shows that he must be a believer because God bestows blessings on believers and people with faith. And that if you are rich and successful, that means that you have a lot of faith in God and God has blessed you. So I wouldn't, I mean, I do think that the grievance thing has a lot to do with it, but I think that this is another key factor that gets to how much the prosperity gospel has permeated American evangelicalism.
Great. We had a question from Tucker regarding white Christians trying to gather power. Do you see this kind of power as part of their religious belief system, or is it better understood as an absence of belief, as in where people don't have deeply held ethical principles, they just seek raw power?
Well, they believe that Christians should have control over different spheres of life, including the government. And they believe that the government should be, that the country should be governed by people who would do so from a biblical or a Christian worldview. Now, you could talk to a liberal Christian, right? And who believes in church-state separation, right? So, but like if you would say to them, well, if you wanted somebody with Christian values to be in government, what would those values be? And the liberal Christian would say, oh, well, of course they should be concerned about the poor and the, this, that, and the other thing. But for the Christian right, this is really more about controlling whose religion has the say, right? Which is their not only Christianity, but their version of Christianity. We have to remember that this is not a shared version of Christianity with many, many millions of American Christians. And to them, they, like, again, and the through line of the book is that their support for Trump, they're demonstrating how they do not value a liberal democracy. And when I say a liberal democracy, I mean that in the sense of it's a government that has separation of powers and a judiciary that's independent from the executive branch. In this case, also, a Justice Department that's independent of the presidency, a Congress that has oversight, a free press that doesn't get attacked by the President of the United States. And so I think that this shows just how much they don't really value those things in the service of being able to have control over the judiciary or government agencies, whether they're cabinet secretaries or political appointees inside agencies. And their priority is, and they would say this, their priority is protecting religious freedom. And many of Trump's cabinet secretaries, from Bill Barr to Mike Pompeo, talk about religious freedom a lot and talk about prioritizing religious freedom a lot. But for them, it's the religious freedom of conservative Christians that they believe is under siege from, let's just take LGBTQ rights as an example, right? So they're worried about trans people using the same bathroom or playing on the same sports teams. They claim that wedding photographers are being persecuted by local non-discrimination laws that prohibit them from turning away a same-sex couple to, do the photography of their wedding or a wedding cake. And this idea that the rest of that they are being persecuted by laws that apply to everybody. And you're seeing this also with COVID, by the way, local or state law, emergency orders that prohibit the size of indoor gatherings. So you're seeing that they are trying to portray these as persecution of them. And so they're no longer trying to say we're the majority. They realize that they're not the majority anymore, but they're saying, hey, like, we're not the majority, but we're under siege by the majority, and we need special treatment because it's an infringement of our religious freedom not to have that. I don't know if that answered the question. I mean, because I don't, maybe they truly believe that the Bible says that, or, that they can draw this out of the Bible, but really at the heart of it is an idea that about political power and legal power too.
We have enough questions, though. We should keep going. How has the internet helped the religious right motivate or increase or promote their views and support of Trump?
Um, well, I think the internet has obviously, well, social media has obviously allowed many people, not just Trump and the religious right, to amplify um, messaging and organizing. And I think also for the Christian right, which relies so much on television, I think the internet has been good for them from the standpoint that whereas you used to only be able to watch Christian television programming on your television, but now, like, oh, if you missed the show, you can just watch it on YouTube. Or they're streaming it live on Facebook or whatever. I mean, obviously, these are things that everybody else does too. But I think that it multiplies and capitalizes on existing media strengths that the Christian right had.
Awesome. We have a question from Alessandra. Alessandra, do you foresee the evangelicals losing political influence post-Trump? If not, is there another demagogue in line to take over where Trump left off?
Okay, so I think it's important to understand that Trump is not an aberration. That there are that he didn't come along and then the religious right was like, oops, like we helped elect this guy and we don't really like him. Which I think a lot of people thought was going to happen. I think, like what you would see over the course of his presidency, say like after Charlottesville, a lot of reporters were calling up his evangelical supporters and saying, do you still support him now? And they were all like, yeah, we do. And people kept expecting there to be something that would cause them to fall away. And there hasn't been. And like I said, this is really, it is about, it's a personality thing. They do like the way he's just bombastic and says whatever he wants and doesn't care about quote unquote political correctness and so on. But I think it's also that they want this kind of right-wing authoritarian method or way of governing. And so they are not going to give that up very easily, having tasted that. And it's not like there aren't other up and comers in the Republican Party who would gladly take all of that on. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that if they lose, that the conspiracy theories and blaming and scapegoating that we've seen throughout his presidency will only intensify in this, in his base, because they've spent the last 4 years thinking, believing, convincing their followers that the deep state is out to get him. And I think that those are going to spin pretty wildly out of control if he loses. And we haven't seen any evidence that the Republican Party is backing away from any of that. And because they're so dependent on the Christian right, it's hard to see the Republican Party shifting gears. So I hate to be so pessimistic about what would happen if Biden wins, but I think the history the past 4 years don't provide me much other than that kind of pessimism.
We have a question from John. What percentage of the voting population are evangelical Christians? And also what percentage are white supremacists? How much overlap is there?
Well, the white supremacist part is harder to measure by public opinion polling because they don't ask people, are you a white supremacist? But they do ask people, are you a white evangelical? And over the years, that proportion of the population that is a white evangelical has been shrinking. As I said earlier, the younger age demographic, the 18 to 29-year-olds, are less white and less religious. And so it stands to reason that there's going to be fewer people who are white evangelicals. So I think now they are 16 to 17% of the population. But the thing to keep in mind, electorally speaking, is they vote out in an outsized proportion to their proportion of the population as a whole. And they're a very significant slice of the Republican electorate. So in 2016, I think white evangelicals were 17% of the population, and they were something like 25% of the electorate. And they're something like 30 something percent of the Republican electorate. So it's hard, I think, I mean, it shouldn't be hard, but it's a challenge for the party to not cater to them as they have for the past, 4 decades.
There were multiple questions about how the white supremacists and white evangelicals deal with those in the Trump administration with Jewish identities, such as Stephen Miller and his son-in-law, and if there's any tension there.
So I didn't answer this part of the previous question about the overlap between white evangelicals and white supremacists. I talked earlier about how the white grievance was a driving force in the formation of the modern religious right, in terms of that overlap. And I think the one weird overlap in Trump's space between the very overt, the alt-right, overt white supremacist neo-Nazi types and the Christian right is that the Christian right is a very Christian Zionist movement. So they very much believe that it's their divine duty, their biblical duty to support Israel. And when they say that, they mean support Netanyahu's government, support settlements, support the occupation, and oppose a two-state solution. So there's that, but then you have the very overtly anti-Semitic part of, much smaller Trump's alt-right base. So that's a weird tension. And yes, Jared Kushner is Jewish, Ivanka Trump is Jewish, Stephen Miller is Jewish, but Stephen Miller remains a hero to the alt-right. So like his Jewishness doesn't really seem to matter that much to them. Even the overtly anti-Semitic parts of the alt-right, because he is undertaking the anti-immigrant policies that they believe are needed to stop what they claim is like the, encroachment on white America. So it's a weird dynamic that nobody has really tried to resolve. But I think that the Christian right remains very like Trump's stance towards Israel, and in particular, he talked the other day about he had moved, the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and he was like, the evangelicals loved that. They loved that more than the Jews did, and I think that everybody knew that. It was another example of him saying the quiet part out loud. All the evangelicals knew that he did it for them. So it's just it's one of those things where everybody's getting what they want. So this weird conflict is not discussed really.
A question about if there's any indication that they are welcoming a race war or a religious war kind of between secularists and religionists.
I think that there are very scary elements of the alt-right, the Bugaboo Boys and these violent types who are going out to these protests, who are, making, seeking out violent confrontations with Black Lives Matter protesters or Antifa protesters. And you do see a lot of talk, particularly in social media or chat rooms or whatever, of these white supremacists, where they do think that there should be, or they want to see, a race war happen. This is not the agenda of the Christian right. Like, to the extent that they are okay with whatever racist stuff President Trump says or does, it's not because they're not in the same camp with the extreme elements of the far right on that. But they do think that they are they're carrying out some kind of divine or prophetic role to save Christian America, but it's not really something that they talk about. It's not like it's not an armed conflict kind of thing. They call it spiritual warfare.
There's a question about Norman Vincent Peale, who is the source of Trump's religious background and performed one of his marriages. Does he fit in with the religious right?
So Peale was the purveyor of this idea of the power of positive thinking. Like that was really his theology was more of this kind of like prosperity gospel pop culture, really. And that, with positive thinking, everything is going to be okay. I mean, like you can definitely see that in Trump. If you read Mary Trump's book about her family, she talks a little bit about that and about how Trump's father, her grandfather, also like sort of had that attitude of like, if just think the coronavirus is just going to go away or whatever. But I think more recently, Trump's relationship with contemporary televangelists who built on Peale's power of positive thinking theology is very telling about why his kind of brand of celebrity and television promotion really works so well with that base. He's very close friends with Paula White, who's like a very popular and well-known televangelist. She claims that, he saw her on television and invited her to Trump Tower to meet with him. And she's been his pastor and spiritual advisor ever since. And they teach this prosperity theology, which basically says you parishioner or television viewer need to sow a seed with me, and God will give you, if you do that, God will give you a supernatural return on your investment. And so this is how prosperity televangelists get really rich, obviously, because like they convince people to give them money and promise them that God will give them a supernatural return on their investment, which of course, doesn't happen. And meanwhile, the televangelists have these luxury homes and private jets and luxury cars and so on. It sounds a little bit like maybe the thing that Steve Bannon got arrested for last week, right? And so, but Trump really understands the kind of the speaking, the way they speak and the way they present themselves on television. They too often, they like to tell a story about how things weren't going well. And then suddenly, these miracles happened and supernatural things happened to make things better. And, this can happen to you too. And I think that's kind of his approach to being president, right? Like just kind of hoping that supernaturally things, I don't think he really, believes in God necessarily. He doesn't seem to talk about that, but like he does seem to think that that somehow miraculously things are going to be fine, or things are fine.
There's a question that mentioned how evangelicals make up less than 25% of the population, and they're concentrated in the South, and which has always been a Republican stronghold. So why should their support for Trump matter so much now?
They're not only concentrated in the South. So that is part of why they've been able to maintain this hold in Republican Party politics, because they do help deliver votes in other states like Ohio or Pennsylvania or Michigan or Iowa. So these are swing states, or have been, Ohio hasn't been a swing state for a while, but these were swing states and will be battleground states in 2020. And so if the election is close, then, obviously mobilizing Christian right voters to the polls, white evangelical voters to the polls are going to be very important to Trump. And that's something that the Christian right is very good at. I mean, the alt-right is a sort of undisciplined, motley, disruptive, hateful movement that isn't organized and doesn't intend to be organized around getting people out to vote. It's really more about changing people's ideas or perceptions. And but the religious right is very, very has built an infrastructure over many decades and has a very robust get out the vote operation. And so if they can do that, not only in states that Trump would probably win anyway, in the South, in the Bible Belt, but other states, that's obviously going to be key. And this is why he talks about it all the time.
Wonderful. We have a question here. Do you have any insight about how the secular left can counteract the religious right without endorsing its own form of authoritarianism, ending up resembling the right's extremism?
Well, I think that I don't think a secular left would want to emulate the Christian right's messaging or even mobilizing, because I would imagine that a secular left would want to promote the liberal democracy that is under siege by Trumpism, right? And so how do you do that? Well, I mean, maybe some of the methods are the same in terms of like organizing people and using social media to get your message out, and that sort of thing, or using television or radio to get your message out. But I don't think that you'd want to create an echo chamber where your followers are just basically getting the same message over and over and over again, and are dissuaded from seeking out their own research or information about something, and that they're very isolated and insular in this very very kind of closed media and political ecosystem. I mean, think about it as like kind of like Fox News, but like more sprawling and more explicitly religious. And so I think that that's the sort of thing that a secular left would explicitly not want to emulate.
There's multiple questions about how the similarities between Christian nationalism in the US with Hindu nationalism in India, or Islamic nationalism in Pakistan, and other countries around the world experiencing kind of the rise of fascist religious governments. And there was a question about if there's other underlying causes like economic inequality that maybe we should be talking more about.
That's pretty complicated. I don't really, I'm definitely not an expert on Pakistani or Indian politics, for sure. I mean, economic inequality is a very serious problem in the United States, and it's only getting worse. And the question of why does Christian nationalism, or why does the Republican Party appeal to people who are the victims of economic inequality, I think is a very complicated question. But I do think that economic inequality is definitely something that we should be talking about more, because basically the policy of the Republican Party is, well, the markets will take care of everything, and like if you're not well-to-do, it's your own fault. Meanwhile, they're eviscerating all of the ways in which the market would be more fair to people across the board. But I think that throughout history, autocrats and authoritarians have exploited economic inequality and economic downturns and trouble to their advantage. And I think right now is no different, at least here in the United States.
What type of strategies does the white evangelical right use to recruit people?
Well, so evangelicals believe that it's that the Bible commands them to go out and spread the gospel to everyone around the world. And so they do evangelize out on the street, or they evangelize on college campuses, or what have you. I think that they rely a lot on one-to-one, face-to-face contact with people to try to convince them of that. But I think there are a lot of organizations that try to appeal to young people or young disaffected people. You'll see these houses of prayer where young people go and spend 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, praying and fasting. So it's a lot of different ways. Colleges, high schools, even elementary school. There are organizations like the Good News Clubs. Evangelicalism is a very entrenched feature of American culture and politics, and there are a lot of different evangelical organizations, ranging from clubs and media organizations and churches and youth groups, and so and lots of different kinds of groups on college campuses and so on. So it's been around for a long time, and it has a lot of infrastructure in that way.
There was a few questions about other authors in this space that are doing investigative work. I know you mentioned the Good News Club, with Catherine Stewart has written at length about. Who would you recommend as other reading and research in this area?
So I would definitely recommend Jeff Charlotte. He wrote the book called The Family, which is about an organization that's kind of at the heart of Washington, D.C. Political power and influence. I would recommend a new book by Kristen Dumais. It's called Jesus and John Wayne, and it's really more of a cultural history of masculinity and patriarchy in white evangelicalism. It's very good and interesting. Robbie Jones has written a couple of books about white supremacy and evangelicalism. His new one is called White Too Long, I think is the title. He's also a pollster, so he has a lot of numbers at his fingertips. I'm just going to turn around in my bookshelf. I'm obviously going to forget people. Francis Fitzgerald's book, The Evangelicals, is like a very good long history. There's a new book out. It's two authors. One of them is named Whitehead, and I'm blanking on the title. I'm really sorry.
Our commenters will go find it for you.
Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot. Kevin Cruz's One Nation Under God, Michelle Goldsberg's The Kingdom Come, which she wrote, about Christian nationalism back in the Bush era.
Great. Okay. Wonderful. We'll just all have to follow you on social media for more recommendations. There were some questions about QAnon and cults and conspiracy theorist groups, and how they've, I don't know if they've become fully intertwined with the Republican Party, but they seem to be this this growing power, essentially, or influence for groups of people. And how does that intersect or interact with white evangelicals or Republicans?
So, QAnon is a conspiracy theory, which basically, says that there's this unknown anonymous person named Q who's kind of blowing the whistle on the deep state, and child predators, sex traffickers who are, running the deep state, meaning the U.S. government, and who are out to get Trump. But Trump is going to come and save everybody. And the storm is coming is one of the phrases that they use. I mean, it's like completely, bananas, and there's more features to it. And the FBI has called it a terrorist threat, because some of the true believers in QAnon have gone so far as to kidnap children, thinking that they're saving them, and so on. So it's a very dangerous and multi-pronged conspiracy theory, but it definitely plays into some conspiracy theories that some people, some white evangelicals, and particularly in Pentecostal and charismatic communities within American evangelicalism, already believe, such as that there is a deep state and that the deep state is anti-Trump and that God has anointed Trump to save America. So if, you need to support Trump against the incursions of the deep state against his presidency. And so just some of the broad brush contours of the QAnon conspiracy theory are ideas that have been floating around, and conspiracy theories that have been floating around evangelicalism before QAnon became a thing that was identified as QAnon. I mean, not as far and crazy and multi-tentacled as the QAnon conspiracy theory is. So what you're seeing is, some pastors and evangelical leaders concerned that some of their parishioners or followers might be falling for some of this QAnon stuff that they might be seeing on Facebook or what have you, even though Facebook has purported to ban all the QAnon pages. And now, of course, you have Trump, saying that they're patriots. And that's how they present themselves, like that they're patriots who are trying to save America from these child sex traffickers who are out to get Trump. It's dangerous stuff.
We're in some fun times.
Yeah.
There was a question about a lot of Trump's public comments and tweets and whether I think someone's behind those because he seems to speak to his base so clearly and so well. Is this something Trump has learned or is natural at?
I think both. I mean, I think he's sort of natural at the grievance stuff. And I think he's learned certain catchphrases that he knows the Christian right base he knows will resonate with the Christian right base. So if you see him, I think this was something he tweeted recently, in the past few days, something about, they're going to come and take your religious freedom away, of course, so like these kinds of phrases or buzzwords are things that he well knows will resonate with his religious right base.
Can you quickly speak to the age demographics and whether, I mean, there's a good understanding that a lot of white evangelicals, I think, are older compared to the young secular generation coming, but is there still a very young base that is going to take over and be there for a long time and have a lot of influence? Or is there going to be a huge die out of Christian nationalists between this generation and the next?
I mean, I don't know that we can predict that, right? I mean, I think it has been a perennial expressed worry of evangelicals that younger people are less religious. And so that they're seeing a falling off of their numbers. But, you just don't know what the impact of, various world and national events are going to be on, someone who's 18 or 19 now, 10 or 20 years from now. So, obviously they're trying very hard to build a movement of younger people in politics, not just in churches and religious communities, but also very explicitly in politics. And so you'll see somebody like Charlie Kirk of Turning Point USA, which is like targeted at college students. So yes, they're going to continue to try. I don't know how long, you've seen this gradual decrease in the proportion of people in the United States who are white evangelicals. And like I said, it's because, in the younger generation is not only less religious, but also less white. So, how those demographics are going to play out with the politics is anybody's guess, but it doesn't look like the Republican Party is backing away from this because that is their base, right? So like, how do they back away from this being the demographic that drives their party politics?
There's a personal question about whether he should debate Christian nationalism with his older sister, who's a strong evangelical, and this is her only justification for voting for Trump. And he was curious if he should debate and engage Christian nationalism.
the person asking the question's sister.
Yeah,
is
so he's secular and
Uh-huh.
she is an evangelical. Should
Mhm.
he engage her in debate over the topic of Christian nationalism?
Well, I don't know if I can answer that question. Is he asking me if I think it would be productive?
Would you recommend
Would
that
I
I debate her?
recommend it? I mean, I don't know what your relationship with your sister is like. I mean, if you feel like you can have an honest conversation with her about it, then go right ahead. But I wouldn't go into that with any expectation of any particular outcome.
How do they talk about, how does the Christian right talk about the imperfections of Trump? Obviously, he has a lot, but is that just, in what way do they talk about that? And is it always spun still in a positive light, or does it feel like they're holding their nose sometimes?
I'm trying to remember if I've ever heard them talk about his imperfections.
Huh.
And I also think that things that other people would perceive as imperfections are not perceived that way by his base. And in terms of like the leaders, they'll say things like, oh, yeah, of course, I don't really like the tweets, but the tweets don't matter. Look at everything he's doing for us. That's kind of a very standard answer. Or another standard answer is, I think I said this earlier, sometimes God picks an unlikely leader to come save a nation at a critical point in their history. So those are kind of standard answers that you'll hear.
There's a question about, have you seen any indication that some of these mega churches have developed ties to Russian oligarchs and the Russian government? How much influence is Russia having on today's religious right?
So there's a chapter in Unholy about these relationships or in admiration for autocratic leaders like Putin. So I very much recommend reading that. I think that what you see more, I haven't done any reporting on the financial, possible relationships between churches and oligarchs. I know that people like Franklin Graham have been to Russia and have, said supportive things. I think other people have possibly done reporting on his, any financial relationships there. Franklin Graham is going to speak at the Republican convention next week. Strong Trump supporter, son and heir to, Billy Graham and Billy Graham's, empire. So I think that, like I said earlier, the gaze towards Russia or towards Putin as being, a strong leader who's defending his country's heritage from, gender ideology, in quotes, gender ideology, is something that was coming into view before Trump came on the political scene. And I think it has a lot to do with the way that these kinds of autocratic forms of government with lip service to Christian nationalism play well to this audience that thinks that America has gone down the wrong path towards, secularism and LGBTQ rights and reproductive rights and so on.
People are curious how we organize in opposition to this. What is the rhetoric or organization tools that might be effective?
I am a journalist and I'm not a political organizer, and so, or a community organizer. And so I don't know that I can, I don't feel equipped to answer that in a way that would be, helpful.
Yeah, that's my job. People can call me afterwards.
Yeah.
People are curious about what's next for you. Do you have other things in the works that you're excited about?
Maybe excited is the wrong word. Anxious, terrified. So, I'm right now working on a few investigative pieces about things that are happening or being done in the Trump administration and the courts with regard to, religion and the law and religion and public policy.
Wonderful. Well, let's wrap it up. How can people follow you? I just posted a link in the chat, but where can they buy your book and how can they follow you?
So the book is available everywhere. I highly recommend trying to support your local independent bookstore if you can. But if you can't, you can get it on Amazon. My website, where you can find links to articles that I've written, links to other book events that I've done, because all of them have been virtual, so they're all on YouTube, and links to radio and TV interviews that I've done is sarahposner.com. I have a Facebook page. I don't really use it very much. If you're a Facebook person, you can find it there. I'm more active on Twitter, and my handle is at Sarah Posner. Sarah has an H, Posner.
Wonderful. I just want to thank you for speaking and joining us today. This is our largest event we've had since COVID has kicked in and all events have moved online. Thank you for your work and your journalism. On the organizing side, we need this research, and we get to use it for figuring out what, at least in our case, a more secular future might look like. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
All right, everyone can give a quick round of applause with your hands or fingers or whatever you'd like. Thank you. Wonderful. If you'd like to hang out afterwards, one of our board members, DJ Klaus, is hosting a hereafter party for all of those that would like to, for those that would like to join us, just to hang out and catch up. If you're not a member yet of Atheists United, I highly recommend you become one. These meetings, we used to charge $10 per person for non-members to attend. We used to raise almost $300 per meeting. We are losing income, but we are organizing actually more than ever right now. And so if you'd like to support our work, we would love you to join our membership or give a donation. You can do that at atheistsunited.org. You can call me, email me. I'd love to help you out with that. But we need your support. We want to continue to host incredible speakers like Sarah and keep us intellectually stimulated throughout this time that fights back our physical stimulation and interaction. So thank you all for attending. I'm going to hand the meeting over to Klaus, and he'll party down for the rest of time. I think if you'd like, Sarah, you're welcome to hang out for a bit if people want to ask questions of Sarah, but I'm going to end the recording right now. So thank you all for attending.
Yes, hi everybody.